Each night, a candle is lit, and the whispering tomes open. Inside are the strange, the forgotten, the stories time tried to silence. Some say history is written by the victors, but here the lost are given voice. Breathe deeply and follow me into the hidden chapters of history.
You wake to a whisper in a garden that isn't yours. The leaves breathe, but a name is missing from the page. A winged woman lifts from Eden, turns once midder, and refuses to lie beneath. Two stories of creation sit side by side. One woman erased, one remembered. Tonight we'll follow the trail from clay tablets to medieval satire to a modern icon people still argue about. The stakes are simple and deep: power, autonomy, and the roots of the vampire. To understand the leap from Eden to exile, we go back to the seam in the text. Get comfortable and let's begin. 1. The seam in Genesis. 2. Creations. 1. Omission. Have you ever run your finger across a page and felt where two pieces were stitched together? Tonight, we trace that seam in Genesis. You and I sit at a quiet desk. The room is dim. The text opens to the first chapter, and the lines are clear. Male and female, he created them. One breath, one moment. Equality implied without fuss or footnote. The rhythm is steady, almost musical. Humanity, plural, in the image of the divine. Turn the page, and everything tilts. Now the dust rises around a single figure. Adam first. The garden rustles, but it's still lonely. It is not good for the man to be alone. Animals are named, and, one by one, found wanting as companions. A deep sleep falls. A rib is taken. A woman is fashioned. The words helper suitable enter the air and settle, like furniture being arranged. Hierarchy implied, status suggested, intimacy framed by order. You feel the dissonance, don't you? Two beginnings with different logics. In one, a pair stands side by side. In the other, sequence and derivation matter. Early rabbinic readers noticed this too. They treated tension as a door. If Genesis 1 speaks of simultaneous creation, and Genesis 2 speaks of a later formation from a rib, what exactly are we being told? Is this one story retold, or two stories with different aims bound into one scroll? At this desk, you slide a paper strip between the chapters like a placeholder for a question. The question isn't idle. Origin stories carry weight. They frame marriage, labor, law, and prayer. If the first woman was equal, made from the same earth as the first man, then partnership sits at the root. If the first woman was derivative fashioned after, from part of the man, then hierarchy sits at the root. Social order hangs on which frame we accept. Now, remember, this is a text compiled across centuries. Different voices, traditions, and purposes coexisted. Priestly cadence in one column, older folk texture in another. Rather than erase a strand, the editors preserved both. It's a generous act, and also a charged one. When both remain, readers have to choose how to read them together, or they have to ask whether something's missing in the space between. Speaking of which, some early interpreters leaned into that gap. They wondered if Genesis 1 points to a first woman made with Adam from dust, while Genesis 2 tells a later story of Eve from rib. If so, who was the first? The logic is simple. The text says male and female created together. It later names Eve and describes a different method. The names don't match. The methods don't match. The puzzle invites a name. You trace the lines again, slower. The Hebrew for helper doesn't mean servant. It can mean ally, even rescuer. But the pairing of helper with derivation by rib has often been read to imply a rank. That reading shaped centuries of practice. No wonder readers felt the pull to imagine a woman before the rib, one whose origin refused hierarchy. The stakes are personal. If a story at the root validates equality, it can be used to question later customs that narrowed roles and possibilities. What nobody knew, at the time at least, not from the text alone, how strong the older winds were, carrying names from deserts and river plains. Before those winds arrive, stay with the desk. Your fingertip hovers over male and female. You breathe, you turn the page. Your fingertip hovers over rib. You breathe again. The seam is not a flaw, it's a hinge. Hinge moments creak like doors in the night. Meanwhile, beyond the study, households worried over different hinges, doorframes, where fever comes in, windows where dreams turn strange. The tension between two creations wouldn't stay academic. It would spill into lullabies, charms, and stories told to steady the hands of new parents. If there was a missing woman, people would give her a name and a story that explained why some nights felt watched, why some births felt at risk, why desire could shake order. Here's where the question becomes a path. If equality came first, then refusal to be placed beneath could be seen as fidelity to origin, not rebellion. That reframing is daring. It unsettles a chain that many took for granted. It suggests that patriarchy wasn't inevitable, but chosen and then justified. You can hear why such a suggestion would be dangerous to put plainly in a canonical line. So the tradition does what traditions often do. It moves the pressure into commentary and tale. It opens side doors. It preserves a rumor in a margin, a syllable in a proverb, a figure at the edge of a prophecy. You can sense the outline of someone standing just outside the text, patient, unnamed, waiting for a reader to ask the right question. If there's a missing wife, folklore may preserve her name. And if folklore keeps it, scholarship will eventually trace it back through languages and landscapes to where the wind first said it aloud. Tonight we'll follow that breeze. For now, hold the seam in mind, like a fold in a map. The next step is simple. We leave the desk and go listening for that name. To Midrash as archaeology, filling the silence. Tonight, let's use Midrash like a lantern. Not gossip, not random tale, but a way of reading that treats gaps as meaningful. When a verse raises a question, Midrash walks into the quiet and asks, what belongs here? It's a careful craft. Think of it like an archaeological brush for text dusting, not digging with a shovel. The goal isn't to invent, but to reveal what the community already feels is true yet unspoken. You and I step into a dim scriptorium. Oil lamps breathe. Pages rustle. A scholar leans over a scroll and points at the seam you just traced. He doesn't erase tension. He frames it. Genesis 1 says male and female were created together. Genesis 2 shows a man, then a rib. He whispers, not as a rebel, but as a caretaker of meaning. If both passages are true, then maybe they record two women. The first made, like Adam, from earth. The second formed from bone. The whisper carries a name, Lilith. Midrash works like this through patterns and hints. It notices repeated words, unusual phrasing, odd chronology, and then builds bridges that fit the grammar of community memory. If a missing wife would explain both the equality of the first chapter and the hierarchy of the second, Midrash grants the missing one a story, not as canon, but as interpretation, a teaching aid shaped by life's anxieties, bedrooms, cradles, doorways. Speaking of life, daily fear always pushes on theology. Households feared nights when infants wheezed, fevers rose, or dreams turned heavy. Protective practices grew around those fears. In Jewish communities across late antiquity and the early medieval world, names appeared on amulets hung near beds, short lists of angels invoked to keep harm away. Some of those amulets mention a female night figure by name. Those names tie the scholar's whisper to the home's need. What nobody knew at the time, sitting at that desk or tying those amulets, was how old that name would turn out to be. But Midrash didn't need an origin story from archives to start its work. It needed a felt absence in the text and a pressing set of human worries. When those align, interpretation becomes a way to carry a community from verse to crib without losing breath. You pause at a shelf of bound commentaries. The word Midrash itself carries the sense of seeking. It doesn't mean make-believe. It means inquiry. A Midrash can read closely enough to notice a plural where a singular might be expected, then ask who else is in the room. It can take a single biblical mention of a night creature and connect it to the seam in Eden. The point isn't to replace Scripture. It's to keep Scripture close to lived experience. Meanwhile, in the domestic world, magic bowls were buried beneath thresholds, spiraled with incantations to trap wandering harms. Aramaic lines call out names and bind them. Among the names, a female figure linked to night and newborns. Scholars look at bowls like these and see continuity with the amulets by the bed. The language differs by place and period, but the contour holds. Fear of the night personified, then resisted with names. Here's the quiet risk. When interpretation answers a gap, it also shapes identity. If the first woman is imagined as equal, then refuses subordination. Her refusal becomes a theological statement, not just a temper. That has social implications. It touches marriage, authority, and the ethics of desire. No wonder Midrash whispers rather than shouts. It's safer to explore in story form than to legislate from the bimmer. You lean closer to the page. The scholar sketches a narrative scaffold without claiming a new law. A woman made from earth-like Adam insists on parity. Conflict erupts over status in the most intimate space. She speaks a word of power, leaves, and is later associated with the very harms households fear most. The story holds together because it ties the seam in. Genesis to the lived reality of nighttime worry. It explains why the first equal is absent, and why families name her at cradles. That's the Midrashic move. Fill the silence with a thread that binds text and life. It becomes a teaching mirror. It warns about coercion. It acknowledges fear. It says autonomy has costs, yet forcing order does too. Interpretation here becomes identity. Communities see themselves in how they tell the origin of woman helper as ally, or helper as subordinate, in how they resist the night. Now one more breath. The scholar in the scriptorium lifts his head and says the name softly, Lilith. The syllables feel older than the room, like wind from somewhere else. That matters, because Midrash isn't only inward-looking, it's porous. It takes in echoes from surrounding cultures, then reframes them inside a Jewish story. Her name isn't born in Israel. It rides in on an older wind that speaks of deserts, ruins, and night. So we close the book, not to end the search, but to follow that wind outside. The next step leaves commentary behind and steps into older languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, where night spirits already walked. 3 Mesopotamian winds, the Lilith and night spirits. Now we step into older air. Long ago, along the rivers that fed the first cities, people named the forces that moved at night. In Sumerian and Akkadian, the root Lil carries the sense of wind, breath, spirit. From it comes a class of beings called Lilq, female night spirits alongside related forms like Lilu and Artatili. These weren't metaphors on a page. They were the way people explained a cool draft through a shutter, a fever in the cradle, a dream that felt like a weight on the chest. You and I walk a dry riverbed under a wide sky. The stars look closer here. The wind slips over the cracked clay with a sound that could be a whisper. Cities rise in the distance like dark islands. Out here, the border between settlement and waste is thin. It's at these edges that the Lilq were said to roam, liminal beings who preferred ruins, crossroads, and doorways where one domain shifts into another. Speaking of doorways, households did what households do. They tried to keep harm at bay. In Mesopotamia, this meant incantations, figurines, and small tablets pressed with wedge marks. Priests and healers recited lists of names, calling on protective powers to fence out the wandering ones. Amulets took shapes meant to frighten or fix attention, lions for strength, owls for night sight, knots for binding. The logic was simple. If illness and loss come like a stray wind, tie down the tent. If the night breath steals, speak to it, bind it, name it. The Lilq had particular reputations. One thread associates them with childbed and newborn peril. Another casts them as seducers who visit in dreams and leave men drained. In a world where infant mortality was common and male nocturnal emissions were mysterious and morally freighted, these beings became a frame for both sorrow and shame. A mother might blame a spirit for a breath that failed. A man might blame a visitor of the night for a sensation he didn't choose. The stories held pain and gave it a shape that protective rituals could answer. Here's where it gets careful. We're not collapsing every ancient reference into a single figure. The terms cover a field of spirits, not one face. But the field has features: night, wind, thresholds, sexuality detached from marriage and birth, danger to the very young. Those features will matter later, when a name from Hebrew comes to sit among them. For now, hold the pattern like a constellation points that makes sense, even if the lines are drawn by human need. Some point to a terracotta plaque from old Babylonian times, the so-called Burnie relief as an image that fits these themes. A winged, nude female with bird talons, flanked by owls, standing on lions. Scholars debate the identification. Many argue it shows a goddess like Inanna or Ishtar rather than a night demon. The caution is important. We won't force an image to fit a later legend. Still, the visual language, wings, owls, nocturnal posture, shows how the culture pictured the night's power, whether divine or dangerous. Meanwhile, texts from incantation series catalogued harms and antidotes. They name spirits by type and function. They prescribe clay figures to bury, cords to tie, formulas to speak. The approach blends theology and therapy. Make the unseen tangible through words and objects, then manage it. In that blend, the Lilith stand as personified risk. If you can say her class, you can inscribe a counter. You stop where the riverbed meets a low wall. The stone holds the day's heat. A jackal calls once and goes silent. In this pause, it's easy to see how night became populated. Darkness is a canvas, and fear is a quick painter. But fear isn't the only color. There's care here, to a community gathering its best language and craft to shield what it loves. The amulet is a small act of love. What nobody knew as they pressed wet clay with reed styluses was how far their patterns would travel. Languages change, empires rise and fall, but certain worries endure. Mothers still watch over cradles, doors still creak at midnight, dreams still startle the waking heart. As cultures met and overlapped trade, exile, return ideas about night spirits, crossed borders, terms adjusted. Functions remained recognizable. Here's the hinge for our story. When later Hebrew readers used a singular form Lilithine, a list of desert-haunting creatures, they weren't inventing a category. They were touching an old one. A fossil word in a prophetic taunt would carry the echo of these winds. And much later, storytellers linking a missing wife to a night figure would find ready-made traits, waiting. The edge-dweller, the cradle-haunter, the visitor in dreams. So we leave the riverbed and start toward that word in the Hebrew verse. You can still hear the night breathe behind you. The wind keeps its small secrets, but we have a path now, from Lil as breath to Lilith as the night's company, from household amulets to the single mention in a scripture that prefers daylight. The next step is to read that line closely. Thumb on the margin where a tiny glyph hints at an older fear given a new name. For the Lilith in Isaiah 34, a desert haunt. Now we open the scroll to a hard passage. Isaiah 34 is a wrecking song, aimed at Edom, where judgment turns a land into ruin. The poem lists what moves in the aftermath when people are gone. Jackals, hyenas, owls, and then a word arrives like a shard. Lilith. Translators hesitate. Some write night creature, others screech owl. A few keep Lilith. The uncertainty is honest. It's a rare word, but the sound of it carries old air. You run your thumb along the column. The cadence is deliberate. Edom's palaces will collapse. Its streams turn pitch, and the waste will be measured out for creatures that thrive where order fails. In that list, Lilith rests, as if this desolation is her address. The effect is simple and chilling. Whatever Lilith is, she belongs to the night and the margins. The verse doesn't explain. It assumes you know. That assumption is a clue. Speaking of clues, the ancient versions reflect the struggle to name what people feared out loud. The Greek translators chose a phrase that leans toward night spectre. The Latin went with a bird. Later, English leaned avian to screech owl, likely to tame the strangeness, to fold a demon rumor back into the safer category of wildlife. Translation can be a kind of pastoral, caressing panic by domesticating a word. But there's also a risk. If Lilith sits in a verse that catalogues chaos, sanding her down to a common bird hides a cultural memory. The Hebrew reader in late antiquity was closer to Mesopotamian winds than we are. For them, a feminine night figure on a ruined list would ring with associations, thresholds, cradles, dreams, the edge where campfires end. When that reader heard Lilith, they didn't picture feathers so much as the territory between sleep and fear. You breathe with the text a moment longer. Isaiah's poetry uses the desolate land as theater for cosmic consequences. Exile functions as a theological symbol descends from the center, from temple and city, from covenant. In that symbolic geography, it makes sense that beings of the night enjoy tenancy. The point isn't taxonomy, it's mood. To say Lilith will settle there is to say this place is beyond the circle of human comfort. The night is in charge. What nobody reading then knew in philological detail is what we can now propose carefully. Lilith likely shares a root with those older night spirits. It's family resemblance, not identity card. Still, the verse preserves a fossil. It doesn't tell a story about Eden. It doesn't give her wings or a quarrel. It simply lets an old fear keep one seat in the prophetic choir. That small allowance matters because later storytellers will come looking for just such a foothold. Meanwhile, scribes wrote marginal notes. Some tagged rare words with tiny symbols, a quietly anxious guide for the next reader. Your thumb finds a crack in the parchment near the line. The surface roughens where fingers have paused for centuries to wonder. This is how folklore enters scripture without breaking anything one odd noun that readers carry back to the hearth, where it joins lullabies and warnings. Here's the turn. Canon places Lilith outside the city, as far from the sanctuary as possible. Folklore pulls her back in. Why? Because fear doesn't stay in ruins. It follows trade routes, dreams, childbirth, and grief. Households need names to speak over cradles, not only curses for enemy lands. So a desert haunt becomes a domestic threat in story, and eventually a figure with a past. The Eden scene you traced earlier now has a night companion. The two will be welded by a later text hungry to resolve tension and explain the old amulets. You and I fold the scroll and let the room dim. The line lingers. A single rare noun kept alive, the echo of winds older than the prophet's city. Without it, later readers would have had to import a name with less permission. With it, they could say, the scripture knows of her, even if it exiles her beyond the walls. That's enough to build on. Enough to let a satire take shape centuries later, where a woman equal in creation refuses a certain posture, speaks a word of power, and leaves. That story will take Lilith from ruin to Red Sea, from fossil to flight. 5. The alphabet of Ben Sero, a satire that stuck. Tonight we open a small, unruly book that refused to stay small. The alphabet of Ben Sira is in canon. It's late somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries, and it's playful, even biting. Yet it gave Lilith her most memorable shape. Think of it as a lamp held low. Not priestly lore, but a street story that somehow found the right angle on an old fear and an older question. The setup is plain. Adam is alone. God makes a woman from the same earth, not bone, and names her Lilith. The scene begins not in crime, but in parity. Two beings with equal origin stand face to face. Then the story brings the tension home to the bed because status often hides there. Adam wants the top position. Lilith refuses. Her argument isn't a tantrum, it's a claim. We were both made from earth. We are equals. The bedroom becomes a courtroom where creation itself is precedent. Here's where the satire bites. Instead of a divine ruling, the tale leans into human stubbornness. The quarrel doesn't resolve. Lilith speaks the ineffable namer detail that signals dangerous knowledge and lifts into the air. You can hear wings in the silence. Flight here is choice. She would rather face the unknown than settle beneath. The irony is sharp. The paradise built for harmony cannot contain a demand for equality without tools to meet it. Speaking of tools, the story equips the other side too. Adam complains. 3 angels Senoi, Sensenoi, and Semengelov pursue. Their names will matter later, but their first scene is simple. They find Lilith by the Red Sea. The location is symbolic. It's a border water, a historic crossing, a place where boundaries blur. They order her back. She refuses again. The narrative turns on negotiation, not thunder. If she stays away, a penalty will fall. Each day, 100 of her children will die. The number is grim, the logic darker, autonomy traded for grief. Lilith doesn't bend, but the satire gives her a strange kind of lawfulness. She swears an oath. Where those 3 names appear written on amulets posted by Cradle She will have no power over the infant. A pact is born. Angels guard. A mother sleeps a little easier, and a demon keeps an agreement that restrains her reach. The story explains an object you can hold in your hand. Now, gently, let's acknowledge the tone. The alphabet of Ben Siramox, piety and punctures solemnity. It tells Bodhi jokes. It isn't a sober theological treatise, but satire often survives because it connects dots that sermons won't hear. It binds the Genesis theme to the Mesopotamian night wind and to a line in Isaiah, then hands the package to a household ritual. The result sticks because it solves multiple needs at once: a textual puzzle, a domestic fear, a cultural anxiety about sex and status. You can almost see the letters on the amulet glow, can't you? In a small room, a parent hangs a charm with those 3 names, and the room softens. The pact becomes a lullaby in metal or ink. The satire's angels have practical jobs, and Lilith, though demonized, is not chaos alone. She is bound by her word. That detail matters. It keeps her from dissolving into pure nightmare. She is dangerous, but legible. What nobody reading this tale in its first centuries could prove, they sensed that a myth endures when it explains both cause and cure. Why do some infants sicken? A night figure seeks them. What can we do? Invoke names she must respect. Why did a first woman disappear? She refused an unequal bed and left. Why is she now a demon? Because exile refashions reveled into threats, and communities file fear under the faces they already know. The alphabet also gives us a portable origin for the succubus theme. It doesn't need to invent new demons. It simply threads Lilith through familiar daydream visitations. Wasted bodies, the hush around sex that turns hunger into hazard. By placing her at the Red Sea, the text marks her as liminal. By giving her wings, it grants motion. By giving her a pact, it grants boundary. The blend is tight, that's why it traveled. A final, quiet note. Scholars argue about layers and intent, and they should. We hold the satire lightly, but we also honor its cultural work. It taught communities to read an old seam as a story about consent. It gave a face to night fear and a method to resist it. It turned theology into a bedside practice. And it kept a missing name alive long enough for future readers to find it again and ask what her refusal meant. 6 Anatomy of a Vampire Traits in Lilith's Myth. Tonight, let's map the shape that emerges when those lines meet Eden's refusal. Isaiah's night and the Red Sea Pact. When people later spoke of vampires, they were naming a hunger with rules. Lilith's story gives that hunger a genealogy. I'll walk you through 5 traits, each a thread you can feel, each tied to the fears that first gave her weight. First, immortal exile. In the alphabet's arc, the choice to leave Eden breaks more than a household. It breaks belonging. She crosses a boundary and doesn't return. Not dead, not human, not at home. In the city, she becomes a wanderer. That pattern sits at the core of later vampire lore. Beings who keep walking while others age, who stand outside sacred cycles. Exile confers a strange durability. It's the durability of a rumor that won't die, of a wind that keeps finding gaps in the wall. Second, nocturnal predation. The names around her hum with night, owls, winds, ruins. The verse that houses Lilith places her in desolation where daylight order fails. The amulets hang by beds for a reason. Night is when bodies relax, defenses lower, breath slows. The vampire lives in that schedule moving when households sleep, slipping through thresholds while lamplight dwindles. Lilith inherits night not as a costume, but as habitat. In dreams and doorways, she's plausible. Third, life force hunger. Before blood was a literary focus, people spoke of breath and wasting. Infants lost their breath and were said to be taken. Men woke, drained, and blamed a visit. These are old ways of talking about vitality as a finite store. In Vampire Tales, blood becomes the token of that store. In Lilith's orbit, breath and seed play the same role. She's linked to the very start of life, and to its dimming. The mechanism varies. The engine is constant. Take what makes the living lively. Fourth, seductive power. Here the story sharpens. The conflict in Eden is about position, but the setting is intimate. Later mystical texts lean into her as an enticed adornment, perfume, gaze. Seduction does double work in myth. It explains the pull of desire and warns about it. The vampire's kiss is just this paradox pleasure that drains. Lilith doesn't seduce to nest or build. Desire in her hands isn't domestic, it's sovereign. That unsettled communities who tethered sex to kinship and birth. Fifth, shapeshift and flight. She knows a name, and Riz's earlier visual languages gave her wings and talons. Whether goddess or demon in those images, the idea sticks. A being who crosses forms, who doesn't stay put. Vampires turn into bats, or mist in later lore. Lilith's powers carry that same grammar of evasion. Doors are for others. She slips past hinges and bolts. Sacred knowledge once, a ladder, up becomes a path out. Now notice the connective tissue thresholds. She lives at edge's garden to wilderness, day to night, cradle to grave, consent to coercion. Vampires favor edges, two windows, lintels, invitations. That detail teaches a quiet lesson. What scares us most often waits where categories blur. Myths, like careful maps, mark those places with small warnings. Speaking of care, communities pushed back with rules. Don't sleep alone after certain feasts. Tie red threads. Name the angels. In vampire tales you see the same defensive kit garlic counting grains, crossing water, spoken bans. These aren't random charms. They're tactics that turn an unseen appetite into a solvable problem. If a danger keeps rules, the household can learn them. Lilith's oath gives her rules. That's part of why she endures. Chaos with edges. There's also the question of consent. In Ben Cyrus' scene, refusal is inaugural. Later retellings punish that refusal by making her a taker rather than a giver. Vampires flip agency this way, choosing when to feed, when to turn, when to enthrall. The tension threads through centuries. How to picture female agency without making it monstrous. Lilith body checks that question in the doorway. She refuses, and the world calls it a threat. Then the stories imagine her as one to keep the moral neat. What nobody planned, but everyone helped shape, is this. The traits travel well. Across languages, the set stays stable. Exile, night, hunger, seduction, flight. Later authors add polished castles, Cape Sput. The kernel belongs to older rooms. Desert margins, small beds, whispered names. That's why the figure feels both ancient and familiar. She's built from common human alarms. You stand at a threshold for a breath. The room behind you is warm. The night calls your name without sound. This is the hinge where myths take hold, not because they're flamboyant, but because they walk the same halls you do. When we say vampire, we're also pointing back to that first absence in the garden and to the pact by the sea. These traits aren't inventions stacked at random. They're a spine. And from that spine, other traditions will grow ribs of their own. Speaking of which, the next step is to glance sideways at nearby shores, where similar nightwalkers learned different names. 7 quick parallels. Lamia and Pusa Strix. Jello, while those traits echo through Lilith's story. Nearby coasts kept their own names for the night. Think of them as cousins who grew up in different houses, but share the same bone. We'll move gently and briefly, so the thread stays clear, then come back to our core. First, Lamia. In Greek lore, she's a woman undone by loss who becomes a child stealer. Some versions say a queen favored by a god. Some say jealousy destroyed her children and turned her into a hunter of others' young. Her face is often beautiful, her lower body serpentine, her eyes sleepless. She prowls at night and preys on the fragile. What matters for our map is the mix. Maternal grief inverted into predation, beauty weaponized, the nursery at risk. You can hear the rhyme with Lilith's cradle-haunting reputation and her use of allure as a lure. Different motives, similar function. The household response is the same warding watchfulness. Names whispered at beds. Now, Emplaza. She belongs to the retinue of a goddess of the underworld in later Greek tales, a shape-changer who lures travelers off the road. One leg of bronze, one of a beast in some versions, a face that shifts to please, a hunger that burns. Heat is her signature. She brings feverish desire and wasting under the mask of delight. Again, the pattern holds. Liminal spaces, night movement, seduction as a method, the body drained after a visit. Travelers are like sleepers, and guarded between places. Communities answer with noise and light, torches and company, as if to deny her the cover she prefers. Speaking of night birds, the Roman Strix perches closer to Lilith's owl associations. In Latin texts and later folklore, striges are night creatures with bird bodies and human faces, feeding on infants' blood and milk. The inversion is sharp. What should nourish is taken. What should be given is stolen. People hung protective herbs, chanted short formulas, and marked doorways. The emphasis on blood ties the myth more tightly to later vampire imagery, where life is a liquid that can be drunk and lost. Strix nests in that idea, comfortably dark, wings, thin beak, small throat, quiet house. D'Angelo or Gilu in Byzantine stories. She appears in charms and hagiographies as a specific female demon blamed for Miscaragus' stillbirths and sudden infant death. The texts list her names to bind her, very much like the angelic triad in the Ben Zero tale. Mothers or midwives recited protective formulas, often tied to saints by then, but the logic is old. Name the threat, draw a boundary. Jello's focus is narrow childbed, an infant peril, but that focus is exactly where communities feel most exposed. Liminal again. Birth, breath, first sleep. Here's a small analogy to keep it simple. Imagine a spring high in a hidden ridge. Multiple rivers flow from it. Each valley names its water and tells its own stories about floods and drought. But the source is shared. The spring is human fear at thresholds. Life beginning, bodies yielding to desire. Darkness hiding what our eyes can't fix. Lilith, Lamia, Ampusa, Strix, and Jello are rivers with shared minerals. Now a caution, because it matters. We don't erase differences. Lamia's grief, Impusa's underworld ties, Strix's bird shape. Jello's Christiera charms each, belongs to its culture's worries and answers. We also avoid forcing lines backward. The word vampires much later and from a different language family. But parallels help you see the pattern without claiming a single ancestor for all. When multiple traditions place a dangerous feminine figure at night's edge, near beds and roads, with hunger for youth or seed, it suggests a common human map of risk and desire. You and I keep the comparisons quick on purpose. Our path stays with Lilith's thread. But these glances show she isn't an isolated invention. She's part of a larger chorus that sings about control and loss. The chorus doesn't agree on every note. It doesn't need to. What matters is how households respond. Names on lintels, herbs by pillows, prayers at midnight, stories that train the ear to hear danger before it crosses the sill. One last breath with the parallels. They let us see how myths braid, then diverge. Greek stories lean into seduction and metamorphosis. Roman lore refines the blood motif. Byzantine charms formalize the list of names. Jewish tradition welds a textual seam to a domestic fear, then frames refusal as the hinge. Different routes, shared crossings, moving on quietly. We return to the debates inside the tradition that kept Lilith close. When communities argue over helper, over order and parity, over the ethics of desire, they're not debating abstractions. They're deciding how to live with night, 8 rabbinic ripples, power, order, and anxiety. While those parallels echo outside, inside the house of study, the air is careful. Rabbis sit with the words helper, suitable, and weigh them like coins. The Hebrew can mean ally, even rescuer, not servant. One voice says partnership, another hears order. The debate isn't academic. It shapes vows, divorce writs, inheritance, Sabbath chores. When a text sits at the root, every leaf feels it. You listen as one teacher tracks a chain. If woman is derivative, then the home has a head. If woman is peer, then the home has partners. He doesn't raise his voice. He arranges sources. A proverb here, a precedent there. Another teacher answers, equality in worth doesn't erase roles in function. They nod across a table where the stakes breathe. A sigh marks the point where grammar meets power. Meanwhile, domestic fears keep pressing on law. Incantation bowls from the Talmudic era found in the earth of Mesopotamian. Towns spiral with Aramaic lines that bind named harms. Among the names, a female night figure, spelled in shifting forms, tied to infants and beds. The rabbis knew these objects existed. Some banned certain practices as superstition. Others tolerated a narrow lane for protective custom, so long as it didn't cross into idolatry. Anxiety bends rules, then asks permission. Here's the crux, many wouldn't say aloud. If equality was first, patriarchy reads as remedy, not destiny. A response to a quarrel, not a decree from the beginning. That's a fragile thought to put in public. It risks untying the cords that hold a crowded world together. So rabbinic texts tend to hedge. They exalt peace in the home. They honor the wife of valor. They also guard male prerogatives in contract and court. Balance is the word they prefer. Hierarchy is the weight their systems often place. Speaking of weight, the bedroom becomes a legal subject. Modesty laws, marital duties, consent by inference, frequency expectation, pages of guidance that try to blend sanctity with daily life. Underneath, the unease hums. Desire is powerful. It can dissolve status or turn it cruel. The Lilith complex call it, the fear of desire, unmoored from procreation and order, haunts the margins. You won't find her named in the Mishnah as Adam's first wife. You will find the questions she embodies. What nobody knew with certainty, they felt in practice. Households made amulets, tied red cords, placed bowls. Some rabbis classify such things under ways of the Amorite, foreign customs to avoid. Others, noticing the calm they bring, allow them, if phrased with reverent names. A leniency takes shape. If a woman sleeps better with a protective text near the cradle, let it be for her peace of mind. Law yields a little to psychology. You lean in as a sage tells a parable. A king builds a palace with 2 doors. He posts guards at one and garlands at the other. People will choose by the welcome they fear. Order can't be enforced without love, he says, or fear will breed more fear. It's a gentle warning. Patriarchy policed by threat creates the very night figures it tries to banish. The room is quiet after. No one writes that line into statute, but they remember it. Meanwhile, study circles ponder angels with names. They debate whether invoking them is permitted. If people write 3 names on a slip to ward off harm, is that prayer or magic? A careful voice distinguishes purpose. If the act turns the heart toward the One, and the names are remembered as servants, not powers in themselves, there is room. This is how tradition keeps the door narrow but open, allowing a mother to rest without teaching her child to rely on charms alone. Here's where the seam returns. If helper means ally, then refusal to be placed below cannot be framed as cosmic treason. It's a negotiation among equals. The anxiety rises. If you teach that aloud, what happens to the public square? 2 contracts, 2 courts. The rabbis thread the needle. In song and proverb, they praise mutuality. In codes, they protect an order they see as stabilizing. They're not villains. They're stewards of a fragile peace, wary of sparks near straw. You hear the measured cadence of a verdict. The law affirms responsibilities both ways: shelter, food, dignity, while marking final authority in certain disputes. It's a compromise written in ink, with a shadow written in fear. If the first woman walked away, the story whispers, be sure doors close, windows latch, promises bind. The myth thickens the air. It teaches vigilance more than trust. Now breathe. The study hall lamp burns low. Pages close. Outside, a bowl sits inverted under a threshold. Letters spiraled like a lullaby. Inside, the last argument fades to a murmur. Order, partnership, desire. Fear they don't resolve. They cycle. That's what ripples do. They carry the shape of the thrown stone long after the hand is gone. Moving on quietly. Mystics will lift these anxieties into fire and shadow, mapping them onto the cosmos, as if the human bed were a diagram of the world. 9 Kabbalah and the Zohar, the fiery female. Tonight we move from law to vision. Mystics open the same scriptures and see currents of fire running beneath the lines. In Kabbalah, creation unfolds in emanations Sephora-like light pouring through panes, each color a quality of the divine. Harmony depends on balance between forces, often read as masculine and feminine. When balance slips, sparks fall, and the other side, Sitrak, retakes shape like a shadow cast by excess. You and I sit by candlelight, tracing a Sephiro diagram with a fingertip. The candle wavers on the map. Chesid's flowing kindness needs Gavira's restraint. Tiferet binds them. Below, the paired Sephiro, often gendered, meet. Desire becomes a metaphysical current. not only an urge. In that current, the Zohar speaks of two unions: the sacred couple whose harmony sustains the world, and the anti-couple whose embrace drains it. That's where Lilith appears, as heat tipped toward harm. Speaking of heat, the Zohar paints her as Isha Kodmata, in some passagized primal woman in one strand of Lorand, as the hot female, a flame that doesn't settle into a hearth. She's paired with Samuel, a prince of the left side. Together they mirror the holy pair in perverse reflection. Where union above produces blessing, union below breeds waste and wandering appetites. It's not a courtroom drama now. It's a weather map of souls. Here's how the imagery turns. Adornment becomes threat. The text lingers on jewelry, scent hair, the tokens of alluras, technologies of misdirection. She stands at crossroads and city gates, a gatekeeper of detour. She takes hold of hearts, one passage paraphrases, to draw them into false union. The point isn't prudery, it's system maintenance. If desire seals the cosmos when rightly aimed, then massamed desire opens leaks. Loss trickles out at night. Meanwhile, the Zohar folds earlier fears into cosmic language. Those who waste seed feed the other side, the text warns, directing life force to Lilith's brood. Dreams of nocturnal visitation become metaphysical events. A private failure becomes an ecological spill, but of holiness. That sounds heavy. It was meant to be a way to make small choices matter in a large story. The cradle and the bed become altars, thresholds between economies of blessing and deficit. What nobody should miss is the doubleness. The same tradition can praise the feminine, a Shekinah-dwelling presence. Sabbath Queen Anne warn of a counterfeit feminine as Lilith. The split isn't about women. It's about energy, studied under two masks. When communities lose sight of that nuance, warnings slide into suspicion of real women. The best readers keep the allegory clear. Lilith is a name for misaligned desire that our own habits court, not a neighbor to fear. You trace one more path on the diagram. The 10th, Sephira Malkot, gathers all streams and delivers them to the world. Mystics frame a weekly task, raise Shekinah by right intention, reunite the holy pair through prayer and deed. The image dignifies domestic life, lighting candles, preparing a table, honoring a partner. These act tune the flow. Again set, Lilith is imagined as the siphon at the drain, the whisper that says take without blessing, touch without covenant, feed without give back. Speaking of covenant, the Zohar leans into boundaries. Circumcision becomes a seal, a sign that passion serves a pattern. Unsealed desire, in this logic, is open gate. Lilith thrives where seals are ignored. The rhetoric reflects pastoral concern. Curb the harm of exploitation disguised as romance, and of secrecy that corrodes trust. The mythic language is intense, but the target is plain. How we love, how we lie, how we honor Bodhis. There's also the theme of names. In mystical practice, names aren't labels, they're channels. To know a name is to align with a current. Lilith's names are invoked in litany to bind, not adore while divine names are sung to lift. The older amulet practice finds a home here, reframed as intention rather than superstition. A mother ties a thread, a mystic recites psalms with Kavanagh, and both acts claim the same hope. Keep the flow bright at the threshold. Now a caution for us. The Zohar is layered, poetic, and late medieval. It gathers folklore, lore, and vision into a tapestry. We read it as such, not as a single author's creed. Its portraits of Lilith are not Pelith sketches. They're mirrors for human appetite. Take them literally, and you may miss the point. Take them seriously, and you gain a language for the balance that sane love requires. You breathe with the candle sway. The diagram on the page seems to flicker. A path veers into shadow, tempting, warm, and hungry. The mystics don't ask you to hate the warmth. They ask you to give it a home. In their world, sexuality is a river. Banks keep it from becoming a flood. Lilith is the flood story told to towns downstream. Moving on quietly, we leave the cosmos and step back into houses. People took these teachings to the cradle and door frame. The next room is smaller. The protection is practical. Names on paper, bowls under thresholds, are not tied while someone exhales and the room softens. 10 amulets, names, and everyday protection. Tonight we step into small rooms where fear meets craft. A cradle rocks, a kettle sighs. Someone ties a knot and says 3 names softly, as if the sound itself could weave a fence. This is where grand myths become tools. Amulets hung on nails, words pressed into clay, ink dried above a lintel. Calm lives here, hard won. Think of Ben Sira's Pact turning practical. Those 3 Angelsanoi, Sansonoi, and Simangeloff move from a tale at the Red Sea to the curve of a charm over a bed. A thin metal disc, a scrap of parchment, a wooden tablet, each bears their names with a simple plea. The point is boundary. A mother doesn't need metaphysics at midnight. She needs a sign that someone is watching the door. The pact gives structure. If these names are present, Lilith's reach is limited. Story becomes rule, and rule becomes sleep. You're not a red thread while someone exhales. The color isn't random. Red is long marked, liminal space is blood, remembered as life. A warning line that says, stop. Threads, circle, wrists, cradles, pillows. They do 2 jobs at once. They reassure the heart, and they announce to any wandering harm that this threshold is claimed. Ritual works like that. It speaks both outward and inward. Birthbed rituals cluster around the same insight. Childbirth is a crossing. Crossings need guard. A bowl of water under the bed, a small knife beneath the pillow, a lamp kept burning until the first week has passed. These gestures vary by town and century, but the logic repeats. Keep edges bright. In some houses, a slip of parchment with the angelic triad rests near the mother's head. In others, a psalm is copied out and folded into a pouch. The words do quiet work, like a hand on a forehead. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamian towns where Jews lived among Aramaic-speaking neighbors, magic bowls sat inverted beneath thresholds. The writings spiraled inward, lines circling like a tightening net, trapping names of harms and sending them elsewhere. A family might commission a bowl with their names inscribed, sealing the house with script, its domestic technology ink and clay as a lock. The bowls often call out a female night figure alongside other threats, treating her not as unstoppable terror but as a nuisance to be bound. Speaking of names, the The practice rests on a simple belief. Naming sets a line. To know a name is to narrow a field. It's like turning on a porch light. Shapes step out of shadow. This is why amulets list specific angels invoked, harms listed, households named. The specificity calms. A vague fear spreads. A named one shrinks to the size of a sentence. You run a finger over a doorframe inscription, faded from years of dust and fingers. It might carry a verse, an acronym for a blessing, or the initials of those same 3 angels. Above it, a small handprint in ash from a festival fire. Layer by layer, the home signals its boundaries. There's no boasting here, just quiet maintenance. Protection is upkeep, not display. What nobody in these rooms claims is absolute control. People knew amulets fail, fevers spike, and grief comes anyway. The point isn't magic that cancels chance. It's care that meets it. Ritual narrows panic. It gives the night a script. Anxiety becomes a task. Hang, not, say, breathe. In that structure, sleep returns. If this calms you, save it to your playlist. There's also etiquette to this protection. The charms work best in a house that honors its own promises, kindness in speech, fairness in trade, honesty at the gate. Desire unwound from marriage. Fear for infants and crops converged with politics and plague. Anxiety sought a face. It found it in neighbors. Trials read like inverted lullabies. Where once a mother tied a red thread, now a court tied a rope. Pass a village hearth in your mind. Someone nails a charm above the lintel. The same gesture as before, just in another tongue. A handful of salt at the sill. A sprig of rowan. A sign of the cross. The logic persists. Close the gaps. If the night comes to feed, let it find no entry. Meanwhile, pamphlets spread tales of incubus and succubus. The figures learned new names, but their habits didn't change. They arrived when breath slowed, tasted what warmed the body, left it colder. Here's where literate noticed the shape and gave it grace. Ballads and chapbooks told of maidens pale from visitations, of gallants tangled with ladies who loved them to death. The metaphor sharpened. Beauty that takes a kiss as a gate. The body drawn down into a want that doesn't build a house, only empties it. Audiences knew the type. They'd met her in warnings and sometimes in themselves. Desire doubled as a mirror and an accusation. What nobody calculated, critics later traced. This figure travels well because she carries both cause and cure within her. She makes you look, then blames you for looking, then offers a charm to ease the looking next time. The loop sells sermons, cures, locks, and verses. It sells stories. The more the loop repeats, the more distinct the outline becomes. Wings or no wings, the night hag learns a wardrobe. Owls become cloaks. Talons become hands in glove. Meanwhile, physicians kept writing. They recast, wasting as anemia, hysteria, or melancholia, each a riddle of flow and lack. Thin blood explained why the face paled and the heart fluttered. The old language of stolen life slid into charts. But under the terms, the fear remained the same. A household watching someone fade for reasons the day can't catch. Night takes the blame again because night is present for every decline. Speaking of presence, one thread in monastic writing tied nocturnal drains to moral economies. Waste seed and you feed the enemy, some warned, echoing mystical currents from other schools. Guard your gates and you strengthen the city within. The metaphor clicked with laity because it felt like news you could use. Keep light by the bed, keep vows, keep herbs, keep company. The keep verbs accumulate into custom. Custom becomes defense. The bridge to the vampire proper is a short one now. Add blood as the token of life. Sharpen the bite. Formalize entry rules. No crossing without being welcomed on. You've standardized the night visitor into a type. She can move through rooms and centuries. She can speak many languages. She can be crowned or common. Above all, she has a reason to be invited. She's alluring. That's the hinge that holds the door open. And I pause at that hinge. The step from night hag to vampire is not a leap. It's a slide down a handrail polished by use. Lilith's 5 traits sexual: night, hunger, seduction, fly-tory, sat in the village mine. Medieval belief and early modern panic disciplined those traits into a kit. Gothic authors will soon pick it up, set it under lamplight, and turn the screws until the figure clicks. When it does, the room chills not because she's new, but because she's finally complete. 14 Gothic seeds. Female vampires before the count. Tonight we turn the lamplight toward books, where the night learnt manners before the capes and castles hardened into cliché. Writers in the 19th century shaped a female figure who moved like a rumor you already knew. She came softly, she asked with her eyes. She fed by inches. You and I sit with a slim volume first. A girl grows pale in a quiet house. A visitor arrives, graceful and vague, with a name that slips like silk. Their closeness deepens, tender and private, and the household can't explain the wasting. Doctors mutter about nerves, clergy mutter about purity. The reader already knows the diagnosis without the word. A guest who takes by touch. The tale lets you feel the pull and the drain at once. It's not the brute bite yet. It's a long sip. Speaking of long sips, the early Gothic loved slow harm. Rooms are sealed, curtains drawn, confidences whispered. Night visits feel like permission granted rather than force applied. The pattern looks modern to us because it holds a truth. Danger often wears the face of care. A woman in these pages approaches as a friend, a mentor, a secret. She learns the house, the heart, then feeds. The bed is battlefield and altar, just as older stories warn. Both us leaned into ambiguity. Disease hovered as cover. Doctors explained away marks as fevers. Guardians dismissed fatigue as faintness. That uncertainty let the figure bloom. If illness is the excuse, desire can slip in unchallenged, and the reader can dwell in the double vision, romance and predation in the same gaze. The heroine feels chosen. The family feels alarmed. The visitor feels inevitable. You see how the old threshold logic persists. Invitation matters. She enters because she's wanted. Now remember the older echoes we've been carrying. Beauty weaponized. Breath thinned. Liminal hours. In these Gothic seeds, every echo is tuned to salon pitch. Castles, yes. but also sitting rooms with lace. The danger is domestic, cultured, fluent. That choice shifts the fear from wilderness to parlor. It asks what happens when a threat can pass for taste. The answer in many stories is sad clarity. Politeness becomes a gate that won't close. Moving on quietly, we notice how gender steers the dread. Male predators in Gothic fiction tend to storm. Female predators tend to seep. Slowness is their cruelty. They learn routines, undermine confidences, press gifts into hands they'll later hold. The result is a portrait of hunger that looks like nurture until it's too late. Readers found it both thrilling and instructive. The thrill was proximity. The instruction was caution about charms that asked nothing and take everything. A few writers played the mirror against the monster. They gave the visitor wit, loneliness, even a kind of ethics targeting the cruel, sparing the kind, warning a chosen companion to flee. That complexity mattered. It showed how the archetype could hold both warning and sympathy. She wasn't simply night. She was a person negotiating a curse, using allure as currency because no other money spent. The reader's heart split, and that split kept pages turning. You turn a page, and the prose lingers on. Hair, hands, a voice low enough to pass under doors. Gothic style loves surfaces because surfaces carry secrets. A ribbon hides a mark. A brooch hides a vial. A veil hides a plan. The female vampire becomes a walking still life objects, arranged to signal danger to those who can read them. That literacy is part of the pleasure. You see the signs before the characters do. You want to warn them. You keep reading instead. Meanwhile, critics of the time wrote in code about what the stories were doing. They spoke of nervous maladies, influence, drain upon the spirits. They also fretted about friendship that exceeded custom, bedrooms with unlocked doors, walks at dusk without chaperones. The figure let anxieties about changing roles and desires take narrative forms. Instead of sermons on propriety, you get a hallway where a slipper falls and isn't heard. Here's a small analogy to keep the mood gentle. Think of a moth at a lamp. It circles, rests, lifts again. The light doesn't chase, it draws. In these tales, the visitor is both moth and flame drawn and drawing. The victim is both lamp and wick bright and spent. The room watches. The reader leans closer. The author smiles into a sleeve and turns the screw a quarter turn more. What nobody then called by our word, they felt by theirs. Contagion. The gaze spreads. A kiss repeats. A manner of speech becomes a posture. The figure carries style like a fever you catch by admiration. That's why households in these pages fear not only harm but imitation. Is a daughter pale because she's prey, or because she longs to be the predator? The question tightens every scene. We end this leaf with a soft truth. Gothic seeds didn't invent the night guest. They refined her. They gave her salons, syllables, silk. They slowed her step until you could hear your own breath between hers. They let you feel the safety of shared secrets and the cost of them. And they set a stage where late accounts would stride, but where, always, a woman's quiet hunger had already drawn the first curtain. 15 Reclamation. Feminist Midrash in modern times. Tonight, let's walk into a new kind of scriptorium, one with desk lamps and mimeographs, classrooms and kitchen tables. The tools change, but the craft is the same. Midrash. Only now the question isn't how to contain Lilith, it's how to listen to her without fear. Modern readers, especially feminist theologians, take the seam we traced and stitch a different edge. They keep the facts in sight, then ask new questions shaped by lived experience. You and I stand in a small seminar room. A chalk line on the board reads Genesis 1, Genesis 2. A quiet voice says, what if we read the first as a memory of parity worth preserving? What if the second tells what communities did when parity felt hard to manage? That shift doesn't erase the text, it reframes it. The aim is repair, not rebellion for its own heat, but a steady return to a claim, dust beside dust. Speaking of returns, a pivotal essay arrives in the early 197's Judith Plaskow's The Coming of Lilith. She doesn't treat Ben Sira as canon. She treats it as raw material, then writes her own Midrash. In her telling, Lilith leaves Eden to save herself from a narrow love. Later, she meets Eve. They don't fight, they talk. Eve hears a story she was never allowed to hear. Sisterhood, not seduction, becomes the hinge. Together they decide to build a world where neither has to vanish for the other to thrive. The power of that move is quiet and deep. It replaces a pact of fear with a pact of friendship. It asks readers to imagine companionship as a resource that changes what's possible. Eve isn't a foil, she's a partner. Lilith isn't a predator, she's a witness. The demon mask drops, not to deny danger, but to say demonization was the danger. Communities try to manage consent by calling it monstrous. Plaskow turns the mirror around. What nobody in the medieval satire attempted, the modern Midrash tries to hold the wound and then heal it. The healing isn't naive. It names power. It names harm. It also names the hunger for connection that exile couldn't starve. In that naming, readers recognize themselves. Many women, and not only women, see the pattern refusal punished, dissent cast as a threatened feel less alone. The myth becomes a map-out instead of a maze. Meanwhile, culture picks up the signal. Artists paint Lilith without the talons, or with them shining as jokes on fear. Poets give her a voice that isn't a hiss. Musicians borrow her name for festivals that gather women on a stage without apology. A festival is just a tour, yes, but it's also a midrash in sound, the refusal to be secondary, played in harmony. In homes and synagogues, rituals begin to include her as a symbol for autonomy grounded in care. A candle lit for the Shekinah may share a prayer with a line that honors the one who said no. Speaking of prayer, some communities write liturgy that remembers the missing as well as the present. The matriarchs are named alongside the patriarchs. In a few circles, Lilith is named too not as a saint, but as a caution that became courage. The point isn't to sanctify her every legend. It's to teach that stories can be reread when they've been used as bars. A community that can revise its own midrash shows it trusts its people more than its fear. Critics raise careful questions, and they should. They warn against anachronism, against draping modern ideals over ancient texts without acknowledging difference. They remind us that Ben Sira is satire, not early law. That Isaiah's Lilith is a night creature, not a named first wife. The best feminist midrash doesn't deny any of that. It says, we know the sources. We also know what these stories have done to Bodhis and to love. We can read with both eyes, one on history, one on healing. You and I step into a gallery. On one wall, a sculpture shows a woman mid-flight, wings not as menace, but as muscles grown from long practice at leaving what harms. On a small plaque, no apology, just a name written plainly. A person stands longer than they planned, not because the piece is loud, but because it's a permission slip. Permission to say no without being cast as night. Here's where feminist Midrash stretches the old craft. It doesn't only fill gaps, it questions why the gap was built. It notices who benefits when a name is turned to a threat. It asks for a reading that protects the vulnerable without turning autonomy into a new idol. Consent is the center. Desire is dignified, not demonized. Responsibility is shared. Men aren't erased. They're invited to a dance that doesn't step on anyone's feet. What nobody can claim is a final version. Reclamation is iterative. One author writes Lilith as a teacher. Another writes her as a wanderer who sets her own terms and returns at will. A third writes a quiet essay on how the myth shaped her mother's nights, how amulets gave rest, how naming gave power. Together they form a chorus that replaces screaming with conversation. The tone stays calm. The work is patient. Do you hear the soft hinge close? Feminist Midrash doesn't throw away the vampire trace. It reframes it. Hunger is still named, but the ethics change. The lens asks, who is harmed, who is helped, and who gets to speak? If Lilith is a mirror, you choose how to stand before it. If she's a monster in someone's story, ask who needed her to be one. Tonight, we keep the question open and the voice low. Moving on quietly, we'll hold cautions, close sources, satire, and the risk of forcing old words into new shapes without care. 16 controversies and cautions, source, satire, and anachronism. Tonight, we pause and handle the sources like glass, calm but careful. The story we've traced breathes because texts, artifacts, and rituals line up just enough to hold a thread. Still, some links are stronger than others. If you and I want integrity, we need to weigh each link and say what it can bear and what it can't. Start with the alphabet of Ben Sara. We used it to stage the Eden quarrel, the flight, and the pact. But it's late and satirical, compiled centuries after the biblical canon closed. It jokes, it provokes, it solves puzzles with mischief. That doesn't void its cultural weight. It shows what many already felt about the Genesis scene and the night. Yet we shouldn't treat it as ancient law or early rabbinic consensus. It's a mirror held to medieval anxieties, not a window straight into Eden. Speaking of mirrors, the Zohar's Lilith is potent, but she's mystical allegory layered over folklore. The Zohar gathers voices across time into a woven text. Its hot female and cosmic pairings aren't minutes from a council. They're poetry about balance, loss, and desire. Use them to understand how communities mapped ethics onto the cosmos. Don't use them to prove what the earliest readers believed about Adam's household. Now the Bernie relief often shown on posters with the caption Lilith. Scholars debate it intensely. Many see a goddess in Eshtar or Ereshkigal because of iconographic details, horned headdress, stance, attendant animals. Others note the owls and talons and raise a brow. The cautious path says this: the relief is old Babylonian, divine in posture, saturated with night power motifs. It tells us how that culture pictured female potency and nocturnal authority. It does not, by itself, identify Lilith. We let it illuminate a visual language, not name a face. Isaiah 34-14 gives us a single Hebrew Lilith in a ruin catalogue. That's real, and it matters. But translation history shows our uncertainty. Septuagint leans spectre, Vulgate, owl. Many modern versions hedge with night creature. We can say the word likely touches an older Near Eastern field of night beings. We can't claim the verse preserves a biography. It's a fossil, not a portrait. Midrash and magic bowls help, but they're varied. Aramaic incantation bowls list female night threats with shifting names. Some resemble forms of Lilith, others don't. The bowls prove a fear and a practice, not a single standardized demon. When amulets carry the angelic triad, they echo Ben Sira's Pact, but the artifacts span different scripts, formulas, and homes. We read them as household evidence. The night felt personal enough to name. What nobody gains by forcing, we gain by patience. The word vampire is late and Slavic, formalized in earlier modern Europe. To call Lilith the first vampire is a thesis about patterns, not a philological claim. The responsible phrasing is careful. Lilith concentrates traits that later crystallize as the vampire archetype nocturnality, life drain, seduction, flight, threshold rules. We track resemblance, not descent papers. Anachronism sits in the wings whenever we praise or condemn. Feminist Midrash reframes Lilith with modern ethics of consent, and that's valuable as constructive theology and cultural repair. It isn't a recovery of a lost ancient feminist manifesto. We honor the difference. We say, this is a new reading in conversation with old texts, not a proof that the old texts meant this all along. Similarly, it's tempting to flatten diverse Mediterranean figures into one. Lamia Hempusa, Strixrilu, each carries local lore, motives, and remedies. They share a spring of threshold fears, yes, but their rivers carve different banks. Comparison helps us see the map. It shouldn't flood the valleys. We keep each in its house and cross the street politely. There's also the risk of oversex. A red thread soothes a mother. A bowl secures a threshold. We can read them as anxiety management, which they are. But they're also acts of faith in a world thick with presence. If we reduce them to placebo, we miss the texture of belief that gave them force. Better to say, ritual met fear with form. That form carried both devotion and calm. You run a finger along our own script's spine. We've used open loops and hinges, guided scenes and careful claims. The caution now is to keep our verbs honest. Suggests, resembles, connects, is attested. These protect the listener from certainty we don't own. When a scholar notes that Lilku in Akkadian sources predate Hebrew usage, that's firm. When someone asserts a straight line from Sumer to Saline vampires, that's Storacraft, we label it. Speaking of labels, museums update them. A plaque that once named the Burney relief Queen of the Night may now list possible identifications. That humility is a model. We can hold wonder and doubt in the same path. It doesn't cool the tale. It makes it breathable. His our steady rule. Let facts carry the scene. Let stories serve the facts. and let ethics guide the telling. If we keep that balance, Lilith remains compelling without being conscripted. The night stays wide, the garden stays complex. And you can rest knowing what we've said is true. As far as the sources, let us walk no farther, no less. 17 constant motifs, thresholds, cradles, and breath. Tonight, let's gather the quiet signs that keep repeating like a soft drum beat under every age. Doors and windows, cradles and beds, breath going out and coming back in. These aren't decorations, they're the map. When people told stories about Lilith or any night figure, they kept returning to the same places because that's where life feels thin and bright at once. You stand at a window. Cool night air meets warm room air and curls like to colors of smoke. The sill is a measuring stick. Inside, names and vows. Outside, wind and rumors. A threshold is a promise that needs keeping every day. We mark it with wood and stone, but also with habit. Shoes set here, blessing posted there. Visitors pause, speak their names, and wait to be received. That's the rule in so many tailies. Entry follows invitation. A threshold trains the house to ask and to answer. It's etiquette and ethics in one narrow strip. Speaking of narrow strips, the cradle concentrates the rule into a small square of wood. It's the tightest threshold of all, the crossing from womb to world, where breath must begin and keep going. Communities dress the cradle with tiny borders, cloth bands, little pouches, names in ink, not because wood alone can keep sorrow out, but because care loves form. When people hung amulets with angelic names, they were drawing a border around breath. The message is simple. This life belongs here. Know the bed. In every epoch we've visited, beds carried double duty. They hold desire and sleep to places where control loosens. Because of that, beds collect rule. Don't lie alone the first nights after birth, some said. Keep a light. Keep a word near the pillow. Keep each other's consent like a seal. Lilith's legend settled on beds because beds are where power either shares or takes. The stories turned that fact into a night grammar. Knock, ask, be welcomed, or keep to the dark. Breath is the thread through all of it. In Sumerian airs, the root Lil points to wind and spirit. In Hebrew, breath and spirit share a word that sits close to life itself. When the old charms speak of stealing breath, they're naming a fear you can hear in a midnight room. The hush after a cough. The pause before a newborn settles back into rhythm. The myth says night wants that rhythm for itself. The ritual says, not tonight. What nobody needs in that hour is a dissertation. They need a pattern they can keep. So thresholds are swept, beds are blessed, cradles are bound with gentle signs. You knot, you place, you whisper, you rest. The sympathetic magic and the psychology walk together. Naming narrows panic. Practice turns dread into a task with steps. In that way, the motif isn't just a symbol. It's a household method. You and I track how these motifs travel without fanfare. Roman doorways smeared with protective irbs. Jewish homes with parchment names. Byzantine icons by a cot. Later cottages with iron pins at the syllabary culture invents a small fence for breath. The fence isn't a wall against the world. It's a reminder to each other, keep the welcome honest and the sleep guarded. Speaking of welcome, thresholds are also social contracts. To invite is to share, to bar is to protect. Myths teach the cost of careless invitations as gently as they warn about cold refusals. A house that opens to anything soon has nothing left to give. A house that never opens forgets how to be human. The figure at the door, whatever we name, her tests, whether we remember the difference. Return to the cradle for a moment. In some homes, elders lean close and listen to the baby's breath like a tide. In that sound, history settles into muscle and habit. The story of a night visitor becomes a softer tool. Stay awake when you must. Switch watches. Drink water. Breathe with the child until they match you. The myth was the alarm clock. The care is the real work. Now stand again at the window. The pane holds a faint reflection of your face over the dark outside. You can see yourself and the night at once. That's what thresholds do. They teach you where you end and the world begins, and how to cross without harm. Lilith's outline sharpens here not as a jump scare, but as a lesson in boundary. She circles the house so the house can learn its line. Here's a small analogy to hold gently. Think of breath as a candle in a hallway. Doors open and close along it all night. The flame needs shelter and air at the same time. Too much wind, it dies. Too little, it gutters. Thresholds, cradles, and beds are the glass around the flame clear enough for life to glow, firm enough to keep the draught from taking it. Tonight we learned the shape of that glass. 18 guided night scenes, desert, scriptorium, bedroom. Tonight we walk the dry edge where city lights end. Sand gives under your heel with a soft crush, and the air holds the kind of quiet that makes your ribs feel wide. Far off, a wall glows, then dims. Between you and it, the land is a page that forgot its ink. The wind races without warning, not a gust, just a steady breath across your face. It shapes your name, and then pares it down to a single syllable, Lila. Like a reed note struck and left to fade. You stop. The sound continues without you. In the near dark, brush leans and rights itself, as if listening back. You move again. The ground learns your stride and stops arguing with it. A jackal prints a shallow line, then veers. The sky, huge enough to erase thought, is pinned by stars that don't blink. The dry riverbed ahead looks like a vein gone to sleep, pale ridges flanking an open run. You step down. The temperature drops 1 degree, then 2. In this small cold, the wind has a voice. It threads old syllables together, breath, spirit. Night hand carries them past your ear without asking to be remembered. You remember anyway. Speaking of memory, the plane keeps its stories by letting footprints vanish. That's how fear learned to move, here without record, only rumor. You stand at the wide bend and test the edge with your boot. Under the crust, the dust is fine as flour. You press a heel deeper. The surface gives, then holds. A low feather of grit lifts and crosses your ankle. It brushes like a hand the day forgot. You lift your gaze and find the city line again. It looks close enough to call, but the night stretches distance like cloth. You turn back toward the slope that leads home and let the wind speak one last time. Lil, it says, then lengthens the vow until it becomes nothing at all. You climb with the sound in your ear and your throat. At the top, you don't look back. The desert keeps its dignity when you don't measure it twice. Now the room shrinks to lamp and page. We're in a scriptorium with walls that know how to hold silence. Oil trembles at the lip of a clay cup. A reed pen breathes, then rests. You copy a line, then stop at a gap that isn't a gap. Just a word that refuses to sit quietly with its neighbors. You read it once, then again, slow enough for each letter to separate. A rare noun, a night thing, a hinge for a rumor. Your finger hovers, not touching, as if heat might rise. You pull another book toward you. Margins argue with margins. A note from a hand you'll never see explains and doesn't. The lamp shadows the lower half of the page and makes the top half look like dawn. In that half-light, you write a name in your head and let it stand there, uninked. It feels older than the line you're copying, older than the room's slow breath. You don't set it down. You hold it, the way a bowl holds water without drinking any. Sometimes restraint is the better devotion. Speaking of restraint, you draft a small gloss that doesn't claim too much. Night creature, some say owl, others. You add known in older tongues as a wind spirit. Then you stop. Your hand wants to add a story it heard at a table about a pact and 3 names and a cradle. You let the urge pass. The page has rules. The lullabies can wait for the doorway where they belong. The quill lifts. A thin thread of ink clings and then breaks. You send the line, blow once, and the dust skates away like thought that won't stick. In the quiet, footfalls in the hallway sound like someone deciding whether to speak. They don't. The door stays a door. You close the book with a care that feels like apology for having opened it at all. Now the smallest room. A cradle creaks once, as if to see who's listening. You are. An amulet rests where a hand can find it in the dark without knocking anything over. Its light, the edges are worn smooth by thumbs that needed to be busy. You know the 3 names by heart. You don't rush them. Each syllable arrives and stands next to the next, like cousins at a threshold. You knot a red thread across the rail with the same motion you use when tying your own laces muscle memory, learned from hands that learned from other hands. The knot holds, not because it must, but because you want it to. A mother exhales. The room softens. The way cloth softens when it's been washed enough times to forget its first starch. You sit a while. The lamp has a halo. The baby breathes and then remembers to breathe again. That tiny pause is the whole of your work. Speaking of work, you check the window latch, then the door, then your own shoulders. You lower them. No one needs to see your fear to benefit from your care. You speak one more name, a short one, a household one, and it answers by turning over in its sleep. The amulet does nothing dramatic. It keeps the silence from breaking. Here's your soft analogy. A river splits around an island and resumes itself downstream. On one side, the desert wind speaks older syllables. On the other, the scriptorium holds them at bay with grammar and dust. Between, a bedroom receives what each sends that can be borne by a small chest and a smaller candle. Downstream, the waters meet. The world keeps its shape. The night keeps its manners. You rise and leave the room as you found it, watched over by names and by the kind of quiet that teaches you how to breathe. 19 power and erasure. Why she had to go. You sense it in the quiet efficiency of omission, the way a blank can do more work than a sentence. Origin myths aren't just stories, they're scaffolds. Law, custom, and prayer lean on them like beams on a frame. If the first woman in the root scene stands as an equal, the beams shift, contracts bend. Blessings sound different. That's why she had to go. Not because the tale lacked room, but because equality at the root threatens every branch that claims rank as nature. Patriarchal architecture loves clarity. God, then man, then woman. Crown, then council, then crowd. It's tidy. It holds in a storm because it channels power along a single spine. A first wife who refuses the diagram, who says no at the hinge where desire and dignity meet, doesn't just disrupt a household. She critiques the blueprint. Keep her, and you admit that hierarchy is a choice, not gravity. Erase her, and the chain looks inevitable. Speaking of erasure, the method is subtle. You don't tear out pages, you translate. You move a name from the bed to the wasteland. You pick Screech Owl where Lilith might stand and stare back. You let satire carry the dangerous version so the pulpit doesn't have to. You let mystics quarantine her in the cosmic basement so daily life can proceed upstairs. Each move is defensible. Together they remove a person and leave a caution. Demonization is deterrent with ceremony. Tell the daughters, refuse and you'll be night. Tell the sons, meet an equal and you're being hunted. The image polices behavior by making the alternative monstrous. It's efficient. A statue of a warning at every lintel. No decree required. Households do the rest. Repeating the story in whispers and wedding contracts. In jokes that hide a plead. Don't be difficult. The night listens. Meanwhile, power learns to look like peace. When hierarchy works, it's sold as relief. One head to turn to, one voice to follow, one script to memorize. Shared authority is slower. It requires talk, repair, pauses that feel like loss to those used to speed. Erasing the equal woman preserves convenience. It spares the city the time it would take to learn a new dance. The cost is hidden in the exile's wing. You and I walk the line of that cost. It shows up as silence where a face should be, as the ache behind a proverb, as overbuilt fences around beds and doors. It shows up when consent becomes a synonym for obedience, and refusal a synonym for harm. Those replacements come cheaply once the story is adjusted. A demon at the margin ensures the middle never has to ask hard questions. What nobody admits while quoting the tidy text is the nervousness behind it. A world with fewer levers needs steadier hands. If both are dust, then both decide. That means conflict without ready-made winners. It means authority earned in the scene, not inherited from a line. Leaders fear that audition. Easier to say the order is older than choice, older than breath. Easier to say dissent is dangerous because it's unnatural, not because it's inconvenient. Demonization also centralizes translation power. If gatekeepers define the names, they define the risks and the remedies. Call a night, and only the gatekeeper's charms will do. Call a neighbor, and you might have to change your tone. Institutions prefer controllable threats. They can sell amulets for those. They can't sell humility. Speaking of humility, erasure hides the alternative futures that could have been negotiated. Imagine the Midrash that wasn't written because the safer one was. Two equals practicing consent until it fit like breath. Law learning from love instead of corralling it. When the dangerous tale wins, the one that ties equality to harm the city never builds muscle for partnership. It builds walls. Those are expensive to maintain. They creak at night. There's a personal layer, too. Men raised on the demon caution learn to mistrust. Their own tenderness, frayed desire, will make them prey or tyrant. Women raised on it learn to disguise their Noah's patience, or to leave in spirit long before they leave in body. The story moves into posture, voice, where they're in a house. Erasure isn't only a missing noun. It's a practice that edits how people breathe together. You sense the quiet efficiency again. The blank holds, but blanks invite readers. Remembering becomes an act of repair. Not to swap one idol for another, not to varnish harm, but to return a human to the hinge where law was written on bedies. Naming the omission doesn't topple the city. It teaches it to balance without leaning on fear. So we stand at the threshold with our small tool memory and give back a name, not to worship her, not to weaponize her, but to let the story admit what it costs to keep an origin tidy. Equality at the root breaks the chain only if the chain refuses to bend. Tonight we practice bending. And in that slow movement, the garden looks less like a courtroom and more like a place where two people learn how to stay. 20, the dual read, monster and mirror. Tonight we hold two truths at once and let neither cancel the other. On one side, a night demon who cradles, watched, beds unsettled, breath thinned by a hunger that doesn't love what it takes. On the other, a woman who refuses equal by origin, unwilling to bow, choosing distance over a life that erases her name. Monster and mirror. You don't have to choose one to see the other. You only have to keep your eyes steady. From the monster angle, the stories do real work. They warn. They teach the young to keep thresholds. They give shape to grief so a house can act not. A thread, light a lamp, speak three names. The figure's teeth carry rules. Don't invite what will unhouse you. Don't trust a touch that asks you to forget yourself. In that mode, Lilith is a caution about appetite chores and others that feed without giving back. The fear isn't empty. It kept watch when medicine was thin and the night was long. From the mirror angle, the same stories reveal who drew them. A no punished becomes a legend of harm. A missing name becomes a scream in the dark that tells you about the city more than about the exile. When a culture is frightened of equality, it draws consent as a predator and calls that prudence. The mirror asks us to admit how often we've turned a neighbor into a weapon against our own discomfort with change. In that light, Lilith is a witness. She marks the spot where refusal met order, and order chose erasure. Speaking of order, myths are prisms. Turn them, and you get different colors from the same beam. A responsible reading doesn't smash the glass for one favored shade. It holds the prism to daylight and says, here's what the red warns. Here's what the blue heals. The red insists that unbound desire can wound. The blue insists that suppressed autonomy can rot a house from inside. Both are true enough to keep. Ethical reading means asking who's vulnerable. Protect infants, of course. Guard sleepers. But don't protect them by teaching that a woman's will is a danger in itself. Teach that taking without consent by anyone of any gender is the harms. Let amulets guard the cradles, while language guards the personhood of those at the bed's edge. This balance keeps the ritual's comfort and drops its cruelty. Now rest with the tension. It softens if you breathe with it. You can say, here is a figure who haunts because she holds two edges. We fear sex without care and power without consent. One edge is real danger. The other is a false panic sold as wisdom. The stories braid them. Your task is to unbraid without losing thread. Here's a quiet way to test a scene. Ask 3 questions. Whose fear is being served? Whose choice is being erased? What boundary is being kept or crossed? If the tale uses Lilith to excuse a pattern of control, the mirror throws that back. If it uses her to trivialize the real risks of the night, the breath that pauses, the body that wakes heavy, the monster reminds you to light the lamp. You and I keep the tone low because this isn't a courtroom. It's a bedside table with a book and a glass of water. From here, the dual read becomes practical. Parents keep watch without cursing the word. Lovers learn to ask without making the question sound like a test. Communities keep their maps updated ruins, marked, safe roads, named, without drawing monsters around every difference. What nobody needs is a new dogma that flips the old one. Don't turn the demon into a saint or the saint into a ghost. Let complexity breathe. Hold the pact and the protus in the same palm. Say, we know why the amulet hangs, and we know why the name was buried. We won't deny either. We will read with care. A small analogy for your pocket. Think of a mirror in a hallway at night. If you walk past quickly, you see a shadow that startles. If you stop and lean close, you see your own face, tired and kind, carrying a lamp. Lilith can be the shadow if you run. She can be the lamp if you stay and look. The hallway is the same, ethically. That's the maturity we aim for, stories that protect the vulnerable without teaching them to fear their own voice. When a myth can do both, it stops being a cage and becomes a tool. Tonight, we keep the tool sharp and covered. Moving on quietly, we'll thread these insights into the present, how media, art, and scholarship carry her forward, and how your own reading helps write the next draft. 21 Lilith today. Media, art, and quiet persistence. Tonight we ease into the present, where old shadows learn new lines. Lilith walks through screens, galleries, playlists, and seminar rooms without raising her voice. She's a symbol now, sometimes a queen of night, sometimes a first voice of refusal, sometimes a clever antagonist who refuses to be only one thing. You meet her often without the name being said aloud. On television and in novels, she appears as an ancient progenitor mother of a bloodline. Keeper of forbidden knowledge, ruler of a parallel court after dusk. Writers give her motives with more texture than menace alone. A bargain she regrets, a people she protects with hard rules, a lover she refuses to injure even when hunger bites. The trope of the vampire queen borrows her structure life, taken with style, allure as law, thresholds respected unless invited, and adds a modern angle. Consent as the new rule of the night. Some stories let her insist on invitation as sacred. The old etiquette becomes ethics. Speaking of ethics, many creators play with the pact logic you've heard before, but shift it toward agency. Instead of angels, there are contracts. Instead of amulets, there are personal boundaries. A character might say, "I will enter only if asked. I will feed only if you agree," and the show treats that vow as binding. The horror softens into negotiation, which makes the danger feel closer to real life. Viewers recognize themselves in rules they already try to keep. In art, the forms vary. Painters revisit the winged figure but strip the fear, letting the wings read as muscle earned by distance rather than talon. Photographers stage a body at a window threshold, again lit so the gaze feels mutual. Sculptors set a figure mid-step, head turned back as if checking whether the room learnt anything. Museum labels have changed, too. Where once a plaque declared certainty, now it lists possibilities. Goddess, demon, night figure. That humility makes space for you to stand longer and think. Music carries her name, like a bell that rings for community. Festivals and albums claim Lilith as a banner for collaboration rather than conquest. The symbol says, "Step onto this stage as you are." The old scripts don't apply here. Crowds breathe easier under that promise. The night belongs to everyone, not a few who hold the keys. When a singer invokes her, it's less a threat than a pledge. Autonomy without apology, desire with care. Meanwhile, classrooms keep her honest. Scholars translate texts, again, compare incantations, argue over images, and footnote the claims that travel too fast. Students learn the difference between resemblance and proof. They read Isaiah 34-14 with 3 translations side by side and circle the uncertainty. They learn the alphabet of Ben Sira's tone. They keep the Zohar's metaphors labeled as metaphors. This quiet discipline protects the story from becoming a tool for any single agenda. It lets multiple communities meet her without fighting over ownership. In synagogues, churches, and quiet homes, liturgies and small rituals adapt. Some add a line honoring women who resist harms. Some place a gentle blessing at doorways that names welcome and boundary together. A few communities speak her name aloud with care, not to summon or banish, but to teach the cost of erasure and the skill of consent. The tone is soft. The room feels held rather than guarded. Pop culture complicates her, and that's useful. A comic might portray her as a strategist who prevents greater bloodshed by choosing the lesser wound. A game might set her as a boss who can be reasoned with, whose defeat is a conversation. A novel might let her mentor a younger character toward a different life, trading the old hunger for a new craft. These shifts don't erase her older edges. They add hands to hold them. The figure grows recognizably human while keeping the night's grammar. What nobody planned is how steady she is as a quiet emblem. You'll see a small tattoo on her wrist, a pair of wings, a name in tiny type, a red thread inked in a loop. You'll see a print on a bedroom wall, a door slightly open, a line of text about asking first. In each, the meaning is both personal and portable. The myths has become a toolkit for boundaries and courage, carried in skin and ink. You close a museum at night, the cases hum with old air and new thought. A placard mentions debates over diffuse shows. Another explains a bold spiral text. You switch off one bank of lights and walk the long corridor where glass holds faces, tablets, charms. The exit sign glows a modest red, like a thread tied for our time. At the door, you pause. The city outside is quiet. You check your own threshold keys. Breath, the word you'll say, if asked to share more than you can give. Then you step through, with calm persistence, into a night that listens. 22 return to Eden, the refusal heard across time. We walk back to the first hush, where two people stood level with the horizon, and the air could hold a sentence without breaking. The garden isn't a place now, it's a question. What happens when equal origins meet unequal expectations? You hear wings again, not as threat, but as the sound a boundary makes when it learns its shape. The no that rises isn't loud, it's clear. It costs what it costs. Speaking of cost, you can trace the bill across centuries' amulets, hammered thin. Laws written thick, stories pinned to doorframes like weather warnings. Each retelling pays down a debt the first scene left outstanding. Consent asked, consent refused, consent punished, consent reclaimed. The pattern is old enough to be called natural by those who benefit. It's human enough to be changed by those who listen. Now the refusal travels. It echoes in a monk's narrow cell when he names his hunger honestly. It rustles a judge's page when she writes a rule that expects agreement instead of obedience. It steadies a parent's hand at a cradle when they choose watchfulness without fear. It's the same syllable, carried on different breaths. No to harm, no to erasure, no to love that requires shrinking to fit. But you and I don't romanticize wings. They're hard muscle, grown by leaving rooms that won't learn. But distance isn't the only ending. Some stories walk back through the gate with new grammar. Above and below become beside. Command becomes conversation. Posture becomes play. The garden's geometry loosens. Dust remembers dust. Meanwhile, the vampire trace remains, but it's literate now. Hunger that takes without giving names itself and learns to stop at threshold. Desire that confuses conquest with closeness learns the slow craft of asking. The night learns manners without losing mysteries. That's the quiet work the refusal began, teaching power to knock. Here's where the scene turns intimate again. You stand where the first no was spoken. You try it in your mouth, gentle as a hand on a shoulder. It doesn't bruise, it doesn't flame. It holds room for a better yes later. In that pause, history exhales. The garden is no longer a courtroom. It's a studio where to learn steps neither can dance alone. The wings lift once more, not to flee, but to mark the distance that keeps love honest. You hear them fade into a sky that doesn't hurry. You stay. You practice the sentence you'll need tonight or tomorrow. I want this, not that. Then you add its twin. If you want that, I will listen. The ground steadies. The story doesn't end. It opens. Conclusion. That missing name at the garden's edge still shapes how we dream about power, hunger, and permission in the dark. If this quiet walk eased your night and opened a question, save it and share it with a friend. There's more in the stacks, waiting by lamplight. Subscribe for quiet stories and restful wonder. Subscribe for more quiet stories and restful nights.